if we think about the three exhibitions that you've just described, Audi, Porsche, and Kia, right?
Yeah.
If you think about the levels of confidence that each of those three brands are currently displaying in terms of their design strategy as manifested in product, I think it's really sort of a fascinating reflection that Audi is like desperately hanging on onto the car. Porsche is like, shit, we'd better put one of our greats in here just to kind of keep the link. And Kia's like, actually, you know what? We're just gonna go full abstract.
Yeah. And then park 4 EV9s outside to shuttle people around, which is the only statement you need, because to be honest, on the streets of Milan, an EV9 in
Would have
that
looked
blue
insane.
or in black makes quite a big statement. I mean, fuck yeah, it looks really good. Hello, I'm Joe Simpson, design strategist at an automotive OEM in Europe, whose views I do not and have never represented on this show.
And I'm Drew Smith, independent design strategist at Studio Fro. And of course, all of these views are my own.
And welcome to Looking Out, the podcast, in which we connect the dots across mobility, design, and culture.
And coming up in this episode 19 of Looking Out the podcast, I still can't quite believe we've made it this far, we are going to be taking a look at two of the most significant events on the automotive design circuit. In the past couple of weeks, we've had the Salone del Mobile in Milan, which is no longer called the Salone del Mobile. What is it called now, Joe?
It's now called Milan Design Week.
Oh, so dull. And the Beijing Auto Show. And it's fair to say that both of these events, for very different reasons, have become sort of linchpins of the global automotive design circuit. But before we dive into that, Joe, we have a little bit of audience participation, and it comes as a result of a question from Andrew Clues of the Motoring Podcast, who is a very dedicated listener. Joe?
I feel like readers and listeners might think he's our only listener. He's the only one who ever writes in. Thank you, Andrew. So, Andrew asked us about, basically in reference to our last show about EVs, about the idea of plug-in hybrids and sort of what role they played. And Drew, I think you had some recent experience in Melbourne. Do you want to tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I was recently in Melbourne for a friend's 60th birthday party, and much to my disappointment, when I turned up to the 6th counter at Melbourne Tullamarine Airport, they handed me the keys to a Toyota Corolla hybrid. Now, I am unbelievably ashamed.
You know, you book 6th, so you can hope you get, I don't know, something German, don't you? So
I don't know, like a 5 Series. Yeah. Actually, there was supposed to be an upsell deal before I logged in, right? So this tells you something about my status with Sixt. Before I logged in, for 95 Australian dollars a day, they were offering me a Peugeot 508, which I'm fairly certain that Sixt owns the only Peugeot 508s in Australia. However, after I logged in and they had my membership details, it was a Toyota Corolla hybrid. Now, when I got to the car park, I unlocked the car, I hopped in, I pressed the start button, and nothing.
And nothing happened?
I was just like, what? And the car was filthy, so the car was not clean when I got in. So I was already in a bit of a mood. It also looked like it had been through some derby. It was just so messed up. So I got out of the car all indignant, and I tried to find the Sixt chap. Sixt chap, where are you? This car is not working. It's telling me something about checking the rear seats. There's no engine. It's not. And the guy was like, sir, it's a hybrid. you won't hear any engine noise.
True. How long have you worked in the auto industry?
So very ashamed. I got back into this temple to the art of plastic, the Toyota Corolla Hybrid, and pulled silently out of the airport car park.
Out of this place.
And then proceeded to spend the next 4 days seeing how high I could get the percentage of EV driving, much to the irritation of every other road user in Melbourne. Because
this is...
to keep the Corolla from kicking in to ice mode, I had to drive like the proverbial grandma. Like it was...
This reminds me of the times back in the early noughties I spent with Mark Charmer in California, where we happened upon this idea that Prius or Prii or whatever the plural of Prius is crept around at like sort of 10 miles an hour around the streets of Santa Monica, largely because their owners were trying to keep them in the sort of pure electric mode. But also this reminds me of one sort of infamous incident, which I've never let Mark live down, where he dropped me at LAX for my flight back to London, and he was spending a couple more days in LA. And just as I was going through security, Mark rang me and was like, help. And I was like, what's happened? He's like, I can't make the car work. And I was like, what do you mean you can't make the car work? And for anyone who ever drove, I think a Generation 2 or 3 Prius, it had the most strange gear stick solution, which is a bit like a cross between a Renault 4 and a Merc column shift, where you had to sort of pull it out and down to go into drive, and Mark couldn't get the car to go into drive. So it reminds me of this story, a Toyota of yourself form.
Yep. So that was my joyous experience with a hybrid in Melbourne. Safe to say, I will be not rushing to repeat it, if only for the sake of saving my dignity. Joe, let's move on to Milan. You've been in Milan,
yes, from Melbourne to Milan.
From Paris to Berlin and every city I've been in.
Oh God,
I'm hungry for love.
Guys, it's going to be a show tonight. It's worth saying that it's 10 o'clock at night where I am and 5 in the morning where Drew is. The time differences are not our friends at this time of year, so I'm tired. He's tired. It's going to
the caffeine's
get a bit crazy
for me.
Yeah. So yes, Milan. I was there for Milan Design Week, or as you said, it used to be called Salon del Mobile, or Salone del Mobile. And yes, it used to be ostensibly a furniture fair, but as many people will know, it's grown in sort of stature, presence, and everything it kind of represents. So, you know, it's in Italy. You'd expect the fashion world to be very much to the fore. But now, in Milan, or during Milan Design Week, there is an array of kind of industrial product design being shown there. And I think many of kind of a big name brand you care to mention, from a Google to a Samsung, an IKEA, a Gucci, a BMW, a Porsche, they're all there and putting on some really quite spectacular installations, some exhibitions and shows that are really worth your time. And actually, I think for us as designers, are really inspiring.
Now, before we kind of dive into what you saw, like I used to do a lot of research in Europe, and Milan and Munich were sort of two cities to which I was often sent on behalf of clients.
Yeah.
And I always thought they were kind of a very interesting inverse of one another. Munich was sort of the most Italian city in Germany, and Milan was the most German city in Italy. And both of them, in their own ways, entirely charming as a result.
100%.
And if we think about what the Munich Motor Show has become, again, it starts to feel like Milan Design Week is almost becoming the inverse. The Munich Motor Show, of course, has really shifted our understanding of how motor shows can be. It's about automotive brands inserted into the city, quite often with these beautiful sort of design-led stands not necessarily all about the product. And
No.
I think what we started to see this year, Joe, in Milan was essentially kind of a similar version of that.
You essentially took the words out of my mouth. I think now these two shows, certainly for us in Europe, Milan and Munich, are the real two to go to, and they are special and worthy because of what you've just said. They're sort of really woven into the city. They're part of it. You're not in. I mean, you can go out to, I can't remember what the place is called in Milan, but in Munich you can go out to the Messe and go into an exhibition hall, but that's not what it's about. It is about being in a place. It's about the way that the brands insert themselves into Palazzo in Milan. It's about sort of, the kind of the doorway that just opens onto a kind of wild world of furniture. And I think, to riff off what you just said, let's talk a little bit about the car brands, because there were many car brands in Milan this year. Just to rattle a few off, we had BMW, Audi, Porsche, Kia were there with quite a big installation. There were smaller sort of offerings from the Italian brands. So Alfa had a sort of thing taking over a shop. Lancia were in the Casina furniture sort of store with the Ypsilon. And then obviously there is a brand, GAC, the Chinese GAC brand, actually has a small studio down in Milan, and they really use that to their advantage during Design Week. And they've done 3 sort of small concept cars at quarter scale. And Stefan Janin, who runs that studio, very much is kind of wanting to make it a sort of part of the, if you like, the sort of the tour of from Design Week. And I should add here that I'm really grateful to him. He sort of took me in, showed me around the studio, and we had a nice chat, and even offered to give me some of his coffee beans. They have a grinder and a coffee setup. It's a very, very simple studio. There's a studio space, there's a kind of coffee and kitchen space, there's a display space where they've got their barchetta concept currently, and then there's this amazing library. They inherited the space from, I forget the name of the guy, and basically the library is kind of untouched. So there's a kind of backroom library with an incredible array of books, and it was fascinating to see, but really lovely space.
Do they have clay plates there? Is there clay, or is it all virtual?
Right. No, so it's all virtual.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a very much a kind of a satellite studio, and I think, as you said, using that sort of cultural hub of Milan and the kind of the sort of really picking up on the influence of things like the fashion industry based there to kind of inspire and influence GAC design.
Now, I mean, this isn't the first year, of course, that car companies have had a presence at Milan. I can actually, years and years and years ago, Lexus were doing installations, and as is so often the case with Lexus, kind of quiet forerunners of things that everybody else starts to fall in line with. How are we seeing the brand show up at Milan, and who's doing it well? And what does well or good look like in this context?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So to answer the first part of it, who's showing up and in what way? In different ways. So as you might expect, a brand like Audi, very much going in for quite sort of, I suppose, bombastic or kind of big name, probably high budget sort of installations. So they'd taken over one of the Palazzo, and they'd done a collaboration with Bjarke Ingels from Big Architecture, sort of very famous Danish architect, probably the sort of the star architect right now in the world. And it was basically, if you looked at it in plan view, it was like a cross. And what Bjarke had done was created these kind of mirrors. So basically you had a cross in the middle of the palazzo, so dividing the space up into 4 quarters. And they were kind of mirrored. So you were getting, in the quarter, you created a kind of the whole. So in one quarter, there were just some sort of like tables for hanging out. In another quarter, there was like an amphitheater where there were talks and things going on. Another quarter, there was a display of Audi's technology. In another quarter, there were 2 new Q6 e-trons. and actually the effect with the sunlight and with the building that was kind of surrounding it was really quite dramatic. And if you got the right angle, you could kind of sort of create these sort of entire sort of singular spaces within the palazzo just from one quadrant. Nonetheless, I would say that to me, it was one of the less successful sort of branding sort of spaces, very much because Audi seemed to be trying to make the car sort of front and center of this. And as we touched on before, the Q6 e-tron, which I think we saw last Munich show as a kind of prototype, was there fully available, and it's somewhat disappointing. Particularly in terms of like Audi once being the masters of perceived quality, certainly no longer. Looking at the interior of that car,
this is the one that has like the passenger display screen that looks like it's just sort of been bodged on, doesn't it?
That someone thought they might add to sort of like
shit. We need a screen for China, quick!
Yeah.
Like, grab somebody's laptop, sort of, rip the screen off, whack it on the dashboard.
Got to final day to judgment, and someone went, shit, put a screen in on the passenger side. Yeah. But let's not dwell on that. I think the point is that I felt, in general, where the cars were not the center of attention, and they played either more of a supporting role or were just taken out of the picture altogether, they were much more successful. So Porsche had done this very interesting sort of rope net sort of installation sculpture in black and white in one of the other spaces. It almost, for a moment, I didn't think they had a car at all. There was a kind of the very lovely one of their classic 911, I think it was 911 T, I'm going to get this wrong, be shouted at by various people, but an early red 911 in a sort of garden area out the back, but just very much playing a sort of secondary supporting role. The real star was this kind of giant webbing of white and black net that you could climb on that made some fascinating sort of photographs, and as people kind of explored it and sort of moved around, it was really sort of the exploration of movement. And they're giving away some nice posters, which seem to be very much a kind of, the swag to have from the sort of auto side of Milan.
Now, how did the Koreans show up? Because if we think about they seem very much on the ascendancy from a design perspective. What was their representation like in Milan?
So Kia had taken over this sort of big industrial space, and I thought their installation was one of the most interesting. I can't remember the names of the artists that they collaborated with, but it was the topic was around their opposites united design strategy, and there were 4 rooms, and essentially one of the rooms was very much a sort of a physical space with sort of material and wallpaper and a sort of mobile hanging from the ceiling that was gently turning. And what was really interesting was, and this was a little one of the trends of the show, they're encouraging people to pick up pens and write notes on the wallpaper and write little messages. And this was a bit of a theme, actually. IKEA were doing the same thing, where this theme of just giving people a pen and giving people a sticker and asking you to write something and then to start to actually create the installation with that. It's kind of like this quite fun, quite engaging, quite welcoming approach. So that was really nice. And then the other rooms were mainly based on light and sort of light installation and light choreographed with music. And here Kia hit on another one of the trends of the show, which I very much thought was the way that that brands were playing with sensors, and the way that smell and sound, or sound and light and music and color and texture, and then even taste were being put together and choreographed into sort of one multi-sensory experience. And the room that Kia had in the back of their installation was kind of incredible as an experience. And they had in the center part of it a band which played sort of within this kind of hung sort of world of different lighting beads and trays, which would then sort of vary their height. And what was fascinating about the Kia space was there wasn't a car to be seen. Upstairs, they had another space where they were doing live music throughout the event. And there were small bits of text explaining how they'd commissioned the artist, and what it meant relative to the kind of Opposites United strategy, where you basically have two words and it's a play on the two words being sort of opposites and how you unite them within design. What I understand from a colleague is that it's actually a development of what they've been doing the past 2 or 3 years. So it's not a brand new exhibition. They're building on what they started and working with certain artists and developing some of these installations, which is very interesting in the context of if you think about developing a strategy out.
Well, also, I mean, just if we think about the three exhibitions that you've just described, Audi, Porsche, and Kia, right?
Yeah.
If you think about the levels of confidence that each of those three brands are currently displaying in terms of their design strategy as manifested in product, I think it's really sort of a fascinating reflection that Audi is like desperately hanging onto the car. Porsche is like, shit, we'd better put one of our greats in here just to kind of keep the link. And Kia's like, actually, you know what? We're just gonna go full abstract.
Yeah, and then park 4 EV9s outside to shuttle people around, which is the only statement you need, because to be honest, on the streets of Milan, an EV9 in
Would have
that
looked
blue
insane.
or in black makes quite a big statement. I mean, fuck yeah, it looks really good.
Before we move on to Beijing, I think for any of our listeners who have any ounce of petrol moving through their blood, there is one car that was shown at Milan that all of us are going to be interested in, and that is the Lancia Ypsilon. Now, for people who aren't aware of the significance of the Ypsilon to looking out, you may have listened to our episode about the Renault Baccarat, the Renault 5 Baccarat. It's delightful precisely because it is, or historically has been, this very nicely turned out, very small car. I mean, the last generation we can kind of forget, but the Y10 and the first generation Ypsilon were quite bizarre, quite lovely, and very much missed. So how did the new one land?
Yeah, I think that to continue this theme, first of all, of what car brands are doing, it was a really nice decision of Lancia to put it into the Casino showroom. So they have, as some listeners will know, basically been working with Casino as they develop their new strategy out. Casino is an Italian furniture company, chairs and stuff like that. And there's a collaboration with Casino as part of the Y10. It's the Y10. There you go. The new Ypsilon. So there's an element of the IP which is trimmed in leather and branded with Casino. I think it's probably optional. But it was really interesting to kind of see them try to make that link, because they've worked with Casino. That it was in the concept car, their chairs, and so really trying to, I think, land or root Lancia into that sort of Italian luxury furniture space. How well it worked, I think it could have been done slightly better than just dropping a car into the corner of the kind of furniture showroom. It was a little bit cramped in the space that it was in. Nonetheless, I think the Ypsilon itself is a funny thing in that I feel this generation of small Stellantis cars were very much developed for Peugeot, and very much Peugeot-led, and Peugeot's architecture and Peugeot's sort of cockpit architecture, which the others are having to try to sort of bend away from its will a bit. I would say that maybe some of the kind of architecture and hard points is not maybe what the Ypsilon wants to be. Nonetheless, if I look at it in a positive light, I think, to your point about this kind of small luxury brand and the Baccarat and all those kind of reference points, it kind of hits the nail on the head. The seat trim, the blue velour, And the car they had in the showroom was in dark blue with this blue velour, and we'll put some pictures splice them into the video. Was so nice. It's such a kind of like a sort of a strong, really sort of Lancia touch. And there's some really nice elements on that car, like the tail lamps. There seem to be, when I talk to people, it seems to be sort of a mix between people just like, no, whatever. And then people are like, oh, no, I really dig it. I really get it. It's like,
kind of like the first Ypsilon, really.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I thought that was, a really kind of, and it's to be honest, it's just nice to be able to go into a furniture showroom, have a look at some furniture, and then have a look at a car, contextualize it, and then just walk out again with no real sense of, the mild ridiculousness that has been the Lancia stand at auto shows in previous years, where I think the joke was, as the cars got older and sort of less sort of competitive, the more show stand girls they would just put on and drape themselves over the cars, and it was just kind of really sad, and it's like pure.
Well,
so to have done away with that, yes, definitely a strong move, and interesting to see where Lancia goes next.
It is giving me a little bit of hope that we might see one of Lancia's other furniture maker collaborations revived, and that is, of course, the one with Poltrona Frau. So I'm
who were
hoping
there in force as well, and doing some very, very kind of fun stuff. And yeah, I think I would say Poltrona Frau had this sort of world of purple in their sort of display space, and I was sort of, to your point, I was thinking about how the Lancia, the Ypsilon, was presented in this really lovely dark blue, but how the Y10 was, do you remember, available in so many interesting colours, and how great it would be to get some of the sort of purples that Poltrona Frau had into or onto the new Ypsilon. And I think in general, if Lancia is this kind of luxury brand, it should probably develop in that way, where they maybe do collaborations where they regularly change the color and material palettes. Because one of the really nice things about this Milan, and really it's the first show that's come back in full force, where people have not been wearing masks and things post-COVID, the return to color, richness, and a certain opulence, really deep oranges, a lot of deep purple, real smacking sort of pops of yellow left, right, and center, and very much with what Google did, very much centered around color, their exhibition, which was just phenomenal. It's really, really nice to actually be at in a city and in a design event where, particularly in terms of this color, there felt like there was just such optimism and life. And sort of a sense of vibrancy, which is very Italian, and really, I got a lot of creative inspiration and sort of energy from.
Final note on that. This would be just so on trend or so on theme for the Ypsilon, because that first generation Ypsilon, the slightly odd looking but deeply lovable one, was, if I remember correctly, the first product to bring essentially mass customization through color to that market. So they had a scheme called Kaleidos, which I think allowed you to choose from something like 250 colors.
Yeah.
And it was basically, what BMW was doing with Individual or Mercedes was doing with Designo, but brought down to kind of the small
B
city car thing, which is just so awesome.
Yeah.
Taking a bit of a counterpoint to this idea of sort of fun and opulence and richness, one of the things that seemed to emerge, at least from my brief scan of the Beijing show, if we shift across to China now, is that this emergence of a greater sense of rationalism, of things sort of being pared back a little bit. We're seeing more function and less fizz starting to emerge in some of the Chinese both concept and product production design.
Didn't you think it was interesting how I feel like it's almost like the growing up of an industry where I was looking at some of NIO's announcements, and they launched the new heavily revised ET7, which I think is the one that their kind of William Lee, their head drove like over 1,000 kilometers, and it has a 150 kilowatt battery. And they, in this price bloodbath that we talked about before that's going on in China, NIO is holding their prices. So they launched this car at over 400,000 RMB, which for the Chinese market is pretty punchy. And they're holding their prices for the other cars.
Euros?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I don't know. But the general sort of mid-premium market in China is at sort of between 200 and 300,000.
It's 51,000 euros. 51,000 euros.
Thank you for doing that calculation while I waffled.
USD, that's 55,000 USD. So yeah, 400,000 RMB. It's quite pricey for Chinese mid-market product, right?
For that market. But then to also hear about how they were working together on expanding the JV, which, as I understand it, already includes Chang'an, Geely, JAC, and Chery, which is to add to and extend their battery swap sort of network and work with those other OEMs to standardize the battery and the swap mechanism such that it kind of betters and helps the entire industry. This feels like a big change in terms of approach for some of the Chinese brands.
I was just going to say, did Tesla once promise battery swapping? I mean, didn't they once promise to provide the charging standard for the North American market? Sorry, let's not touch Tesla.
Let's not go there. I think if you want to read about their ill-fated charge swap thing, there's a chapter in Ed Niedermeyer's book, Ludicrous, which I think describes just how
ludicrous.
How should we say? Ludicrous. That was.
But I think
it feels like a sort of maturation.
Point. Yeah, we're also starting to see a consolidation, right? And I mean, this is what happens as any market sort of really starts to mature. You have this explosion of new entrants, and then as conditions tighten, people are like, "Oh, Christ, maybe we can't run our battery swap network all on its own when there's 4 other companies trying to do exactly the same thing."
But I think the other thing about what NIO are doing is that when you think about it, it's quite basic economics. The very, very low prices we talked about before in China, these amazing cars that you can get for sort of say 200,000 RMB, it's a clear play to win market share. You're not making any money there. Everyone knows that people aren't making any money in that market. I think this is the first time we're seeing a Chinese brand, NIO, trying to say, okay, we are maybe going to we're going to be willing to sacrifice sales and market share for trying to hold the line, actually make some money on the cars, and position ourselves as a sort of truly premium brand. And we've talked about NIO quite a bit on and off, but never directly. It's not really working for them in Europe, as far as we understand. Nonetheless, we both have exposure and experience of their products. They are very impressive, and certainly in the Chinese market and the ecosystem they built up around the brand, it is very much a premium offer. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that works out for them in terms of how their sales hold up with trying to hold this higher pricing.
And it will also be interesting to see if this means that we start to see that decimation of European brands, which has been happening sort of in the lower to mid pricing segments, start to move up, right?
Yeah, because we've already started to see some casualties. We talked about Hi-Fi, which were very much in the sort of upper echelon in terms of pricing. And there's a lot of conversation, I think, around Zeta at the moment. But I think to your point, Drew, about the sort of the impact on the Western brands, the other thing that I thought was interesting about the Beijing show, and I wanted to get your opinion on, was I thought it was notable how the Western brands came back and seemed to be actually trumpeting their new JVs or investments with the Chinese brands. So we have almost like a role reversal. For those that know, the what's happened over the past 20 years is that most of the Western brands have had to set up JVs in order to sell in China. The Chinese partner took sort of roughly 50%. And then what's happened is the Chinese have learnt and then have gone on to better and more speedily sort of create their own market. And now many of the Western brand sales are sort of falling off a cliff. And what's happening now is that you've got brands like Volkswagen actually starting up new sort of joint ventures, not joint ventures maybe, but investments into or sort of agreements with, in their case, XPeng, where they get to use XPeng's technology platform. They showed the VW ID code, which I think was sort of loosely on the XPeng platform, and actually really trying to push that, we're using kind of Chinese technology and know-how here. That is an absolutely fantastic turnaround in terms of positioning compared to sort of even 10 years, but certainly 20 years ago. And you also had Stellantis, who weren't at the show, but have recently sort of invested heavily, I think maybe bought the majority of Leapmotor. And apparently Stellantis executives at the show saying that Leapmotor was their 14th brand in the Stellantis group. So really, really interesting sort of tone direction here.
Well, and I think it also casts in an interesting light Elon's recent trip to China and the announcements around full self-driving, right?
Yes.
Which, of course, is increasingly looking like the source of a potential downfall, or at least a significant component of a downfall in the North American market. Elon went to China and has been trumpeting the fact that full self-driving is now full go in the Chinese market. So as you say, we're sort of seeing this interesting sort of reverse injection with China. I think the Tesla thing raises a whole bunch of very interesting questions around, okay, well, if full self-driving is an AI-driven model that needs to be processed on Tesla's computers, then how is that data coming out of China, and is it going to be processed in North America? And if it's not, and Tesla's going to have to install its computers in China, then surely the Americans are going to have something to say about that. But anyway,
isn't it some kind of tie up with Baidu though? Is it going to run on Baidu's servers, or have I made that up?
Right. So I think you still come to the question of the export of IP from North America and setting up that artificial intelligence IP in China. But yeah, like there's just a bunch of really. We talked on the last show about how certainly from a product availability point of view, this deglobalization, and yet what we're seeing in terms of IP is maybe that is not going to be the case.
No.
Just because the Germans, for example, have been at such a disadvantage for so long in the Chinese market.
Yeah. I want to close on the Beijing show a couple of things. The first thing is I wanted to maybe not challenge, but you said there's a sort of it's becoming more sort of you didn't use these words, but you said almost like more. I took it to really sort of more normalized, more sort of professional, sophisticated. But I still think when you look at some of the cars that were shown, there's still interesting exploration of typology happening in the Chinese market that isn't really happening in Europe and the US. So 100%. I'm really into the Chang'an EO7, as it's now called. We've actually seen this sort of preview of this. It's changed its name a few times. This is the one that's kind of like a jacked up fastback, except the rear is basically a pickup bed, sort of where you might have the trunk. It's fascinating new typology. And can we just briefly, Drew, talk about the Zika mix?
Yes!
Which
shout out to the Zika crew.
Shout out to the Zika crew who are very
we know a lot of them. We're
Yes.
quite close to a few of them.
I was going to say I see some of them on a typical given day. They share the same hometown as me. But yes, I mean, Zika Mix, which is the sort of passenger version of what we believe will become Waymo's RoboCab that's coming from Zika. But such a great sort of a really interesting typology, very sort of unapologetically a monovolume, but with a bloody incredible interior and things like the door opening system, no B-pillar, and what was your take on it?
Just sheer delight, because I think what they have managed to do is what I have been bitching and moaning about. I think ever since we started recording this show, is that we haven't really seen strong examples of car makers taking advantage of the packaging freedoms afforded by from first principles EV drivetrains and packages. And I think the Li Auto Mega was kind of the first hint that we might start to see something different. I think in some ways, and bearing in mind I haven't seen either of these cars in the flesh, the Zika Mix is in some ways even more impressive. Because it is a beautifully resolved but fairly unassuming exterior that just opens up to reveal this breath of fresh air.
Space.
It's like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So I would love to see more of this. Right?
Yeah.
We should be able to do more than, great start, Zika, like love the monovolume. What else can you do? And I know there is the talent on that bench to go really, really far with this kind of stuff. And I'm just super happy to see it.
And without wanting to sound like I'm ass-kissing people that I know quite well, I think it's really nice that the team in Gothenburg is led, you've obviously got Stefan as head of that team, but then from an exterior and interior and color material, it's a really young team. It's people sort of our age and younger who are leading those teams and really showing what fresh talent can do. So big props to the likes of Ewan and Sergio and all the guys there. It's
Javi,
really, really
Marcus.
Yeah,
shout outs. Shout outs. Before we move on from Beijing, we absolutely cannot ignore the Xiaomi SU7.
No. I was funny because you said sort of what's next, and obviously one of our sort of friends, we are fans of Chris Bangle was, we think, somehow involved in that car.
Such a weird video.
And he signs off that very weird video by going, "What's next?" And without wanting to jump the gun on this, I'm very curious to understand what will come next from Xiaomi, because it's an amazing sort of first product. But Drew, to come back to the car itself, the SU7, it dominated the headlines from Beijing. The only car, I believe, with a queue to get on the stand that trailed around the exhibition hall, as far as I can understand, but already in the showrooms for Xiaomi as well, and with pre-orders that are really quite impressive and, sort of piling up by the day. And it seems to be the car that the Chinese really want.
Well, and I'm going to paste into the video version of this podcast a little TikTok video that has come out of China, which demonstrates in a subtle but really unbelievably significant way just how different the thinking is around this car. And it is
the accessorization of physical controls and things.
It's like Chris Bangle's sketches of what would become like the Opel Corsa, I think.
Yeah, the junior concept, the modular.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like
Chris has patents on a lot of those things, I believe he said on those modules. Did have.
Well, isn't it funny that Chris is kind of involved in Xiaomi somehow, and all of a sudden we see influencers showing how all of these accessories being unboxed and attached to the car. And we're not just talking functional accessories like, thank fucking Christ, being able to attach physical buttons to your touchscreen, but also things like adding sort of LED light bars, right?
Yeah.
And cameras and all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. And again, it's like we are in an age where we have the technology, both software and hardware, to enable this level of sort of personalization of the interior space of the car. Nobody's really done it like this. And it's just super cool to see. And that's before you even get to the stuff that we've talked about ad infinitum, which is how the SU7 integrates itself into a broader digital ecosystem.
Yeah. Yes, so fascinating to see what comes next from them. And I can't wait to have a play with SU7. But I think that sort of sums up Beijing. Anything else
Probably,
you want to mention?
I don't want to touch Tesla. I mean, just a bit of a rolling shit show at the moment, isn't it? Like,
shit show, bin fire, like soap opera.
I think the only thing I want to comment on is what has happened with the supercharger team, and I think we've.
That's
we made a joke, funnily enough, I think it was in the last show, about what might happen if the supercharger network was nationalized. And I think, the rug pull that this represents for the OEMs selling EVs in North America that adopted the North American charging standard, so Tesla's charging plug, is quite significant. And there will be, I have a feeling, a lot of scratched heads and squeaky bums in conference rooms trying to work out, what does this actually mean for not just our business, but also its impact on EV adoption? Because it's something that could have an enormous chilling effect on consumers' willingness to invest.
I have two very sort of opposing takes on this. One is that apparently all the standards when these deals were done was sort of signed over and opened up. And in terms of the charging standard and the kind of general adoption and all the other OEMs moving to it, it is now the North American standard. It's not, it is the Tesla standard, but it's very much North American standard. It's understood it can be built out by other people. So there's not really a risk that something in that side of, the actual plugs and the technology is kind of pulled away as a rug. But as you say, the supercharging network has been important and powerful, not simply because of how and where and how dense the network was built out in a way which meant long road trips were possible. It's been about that network's reliability and, if you like, uptime, compared particularly to the horror stories that I think our American friends and colleagues talk about with someone like Electrify America. And I think the worry then here is, well, if that entire team is gone, what happens now? What happens when charges go offline? What happens? I've seen a lot of things on Threads and Twitter this week going, oh, we own a hotel. We were literally about to kind of have this installed. This wiring was in, and now we don't know what's going on. Lots of kind of questions like that. And I think, as you say, if that supercharged network suddenly starts to falter in terms of its reliability and uptime, that creates a huge headache potentially for everybody, because you've got all that existing base of Tesla owners who rely on it, and it opening up to a much, much wider base. And I think it is the only thing in North America that's kind of there to support the rollout and, sort of widespread adoption of EVs. And if it goes flaky, I would say that causes potentially some very, very big issues for that market and for all of us who are trying to sell electric vehicles into it.
Well, we've been in the fuck around phase of Tesla for quite some time. We are now very much in the find out phase. And it will be interesting to see how things have evolved by our next show, Joe.
Because it's literally moving that fast.
It is literally moving that fast. I think that'll do us for this week. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. We'd love to have you along for the ride. If you like our show, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts. If you're on YouTube, hit that bell, subscribe. But for now...
And tell your friends.
Oh, yeah, and tell your friends. Very much tell your friends. For now, this has been Looking Out the Podcast. My name is Drew Smith.
And my name is Joe Simpson. And thank you very much for listening.
For listening.
And watching.
See you in 2 weeks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah. Maybe we shouldn't talk about Tesla, but I figured if we ran out of things to say, you might want to go on a waffle? Sorry, very rude. A rant.
Thanks, Joe.
About Elon. Just waffle. Yeah.
I'm good at a waffle.
Drew's waffling about Tesla again.
Oh, God, here comes the angry man shouting at the moon. Get off my lawn, Elon!